Good evening, and welcome to episode 124 of the Political Mike podcast. The 60th U.S. presidential election is upon us, and it has already proven itself to be an epic showdown like none other. The entire nation, along with the world, is engulfed in a tempest of political uncertainty. This election, the most crucial election since 1864, is a high-stakes battle where the core of American democracy hangs in the balance, teetering on the edge of vanishing and the looming specter of authoritarianism. The guardians against cyber threats, the titans tasked with ensuring the sanctity of our elections, Jen Easterly of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, and General Paul Sohn, the head of U.S. Cyber Command and the National Security Agency, boldly declared that this year's ballot will be the Fort Knox of elections. Despite foreign nations eyeing interference, their conviction is unwavering. The American people should have absolute confidence in the integrity of our election infrastructure, according to these officials. A Quinnipiac University poll is also shaking up the political landscape, revealing a growing gender gap that could tip the scales. President Joe Biden edges ahead of former President Donald Trump, with women emerging as the game changers. The tides are turning and the battleground is set. Former President Donald Trump has made it his mission to halt the ongoing and concluding border security negotiations taking place in the United States Senate from becoming a bill that could potentially benefit President Biden politically. Trump and Teamsters President Sean O'Brien clashed over the southern border at the International Brotherhood of Teamsters headquarters. Trump argued for closing the border, citing it as an existential crisis for unions, while O'Brien disagreed, emphasizing the union's support for immigrant workers and underlying the need for further interviews with candidates, including President Joe Biden, before making an endorsement decision for the 2024 presidential race. Nikki Haley, Trump's sole opponent in the Republican primary, faced questions about former President Trump mocking her birth name on the Breakfast Club with Charlemagne the God. While she avoided directly labeling it as racist, she emphasized her candidacy as a counter to a potential Kamala Harris presidency, asserting that the next female president would either be Harris or herself. Haley exclaimed that a Kamala Harris presidency should send chills up everyone's spine. Former President Donald Trump has been ordered by a jury to pay $83.3 million to writer E. Jean Carroll for defamation remarks made during his presidency in response to her rape accusation. The damages meant to punish Trump for repeatedly attacking Carroll include $18.3 million in compensatory damages and $65 million in punitive damages, highlighting the ongoing legal challenges Trump faces over his comments and behavior. Mind you, the former president has 91 felony charges hanging over his head. Presidential historian and creator of the Keys to the White House model, Professor Allan Lichtman, has accurately predicted every election since 1984, and he has played a pivotal role in crafting an amicus brief for the United States support. Signed by 25 of the nation's leading historians, this brief in the Trump disqualification case argues for the applicability of Section 3 of the 14th Amendment to the President of the United States. It asserts that this section doesn't just target ex-Confederates, but it applies to future insurrectionists. Stay tuned as we unravel the insights of this political virtuoso and dive deep into the seismic shifts shaping the political landscape. The 60th U.S. presidential election is not just an event. It's a narrative being written before our eyes, and we're here to break it down for you. Professor Lichtman, it's always a treat to have you on the platform. Thanks for being here.
My pleasure.
So can you give us some insight about this amicus brief that you've been a part of and the argument that's being made in this amicus brief?
Yes. What's really important to understand is when you're dealing with the interpretation of the U.S. Constitution, the conservatives on the Supreme Court have said they're originalists. They want to understand what the framers believed the provisions of the Constitution that they put into effect actually meant. And therefore, I thought it would be of great value to bring together some of the nation's leading historians. I was actually pretty surprised we got 25. That's just an amazing array of intellectual firepower. And our objective was not to make political arguments, not to get involved in the legal arguments, but rather to look at contemporaneous history from the decision makers at the time, and apply standard historical methods to that evidence to give the court's guidance in reaching their ultimate decision. In other words, to tell them what's the right history, not the fake history. And we reached a number of conclusions. First and most important conclusion was that Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, the disqualification clause, applies to the President of the United States. We uncovered direct evidence of this, that this issue was raised in Senate debates over the adoption of Section 3. A Democratic critic of the 14th Amendment, Senator Reverdy Johnson, said, "Why didn't you specifically name the president? Did you leave him out?" And Senator Lott Merrill, a major supporter of Reconstruction and the amendment, said, "Oh no, he is covered as an officer of the United States." Johnson then said, "You're right. I stand corrected," and no other senator arose to dispute the notion that Section 3 covered the president. Then a few years later, you had debates over amnesty. That is, should you relieve ex Confederates from the disqualification of Section 3? And the decision makers again recognized that Section 3 disqualified any ex Confederate who had taken an oath to support the U.S. from running for president, including former President Jefferson Davis of the Confederacy. And they specifically decided to exclude Davis from amnesty because they were afraid if they relieved the disqualification that he would in fact run for president under the Democratic ticket. Further evidence they fully understood that Section 3 includes the president. We also found that because they put it in the Constitution, decision makers recognized that they meant Section 3 to apply in perpetuity. It was not just a statute like they had used previously. And finally, they recognized that Section 3 applied instantaneously. The moment the states ratified the 14th Amendment, it required no additional act of Congress or even a conviction. The thousands of ex Confederates disqualified were instantly disqualified. None of them were disqualified by another act of Congress or a conviction, among them Jefferson Davis. And Jefferson Davis, in fact, tried to use his instant disqualification to quash his prosecution for treason. His lawyers said, yes, Mr. Davis was instantly disqualified the day that the states ratified the 14th Amendment, and we don't believe, therefore, he should be punished for treason because that would be double jeopardy. That argument never got resolved because ultimately the prosecution was dropped, but no one involved disputed that he was instantly disqualified for running for president or any other office upon ratification of the amendment. So those were crucial points that we think the Supreme Court must take into account whatever legal decision it reaches.
And before I ask my next question, just a side note, presidential trivia. Wasn't John Tyler married to the daughter of Jefferson Davis? Is that correct?
I
President
think
John
that
Tyler?
is true. Yes, I think that is a interesting piece of historical trivia.
Now, there were some conservative critics who saw my latest episode with you, episode 113, and they heard you say that we came this close to losing our democracy, and they responded by saying, "Well, we're a republic. We're not a real democracy." And what do you say in response to those?
We're a democratic republic.
Thank
We
you.
operate under democratic principles to elect our leaders. So when one says our democracy is in danger, we mean the sovereignty of the people, which underlies our democratic republic, is in danger. And instead of having the people choose their leaders, we could be moving into more of an authoritarian system, which unfortunately is uh, a trend all over the world. You know, democracy is in retreat everywhere, and it is in danger here too. You know, democracy is precious, but like all precious things, it can be destroyed.
Professor Lichtman, what is your take on those? You had Chris Christie, who was the strongest um, and most adamant critic of Donald Trump in the Republican primary, this primary cycle, even saying, along with Nikki Haley and others, that Donald Trump should not have been removed from the ballot from the court system, that the voters made that decision. What do you
That's yeah,
take on?
that's just wrong. The constitutional disqualification under the 14th Amendment is no different than any other disqualification. Say, because you're not of age, or you weren't born as a natural born U.S. citizen, or you didn't achieve the residency requirements. Those constitutional questions are not decided by the voters, they occur prior to the vote to disqualify anyone from even running for president of the United States. And after all, you know this, Mike. Who was it that for 5 years claimed that Barack Obama was constitutionally disqualified to be president because, quite falsely, they said he was born in Africa? Who did that for 5 years, Mike?
Let me think.
Donald
Trump.
Trump. Yes. And
Donald
now,
J.
of
Trump.
course, he's totally reversed his position.
So, Professor, as I mentioned in the introduction of this episode, the former president faces 91 felony charges, and most recently, he has been ordered to pay over $83 million to E. Jean Carroll for defamation. How might the recent legal troubles and defamation case against Trump, as well as the financial penalties imposed, influence your assessment of the scandal key in the keys to the White House? I think I can already anticipate your response, but I
Yeah.
think go ahead.
It doesn't affect the scandal key because remember, the whole principle behind the keys to the White House is that American presidential elections are essentially votes up or down on the strength and performance of the party holding the White House. Do they merit 4 more years? And the identity and the characteristics of the opposition candidate don't matter very much. They would only turn against the White House party if you have an extraordinary, inspirational, charismatic candidate like a Ronald Reagan for the Republicans or a Franklin Roosevelt for the Democrats. But let me say this, and this is very important. I'm not psychic Gene Dixon. I don't have a crystal ball. My system, as you know, is based on history. It's a very robust system. Goes all the way back retrospectively to 1860. The election of Abe Lincoln, who, by the way, I did not know, contrary to a lot of rumors, and prospectively, it's worked since 1984. However, there could always be events so cataclysmic that they could break the pattern of history. And we may be facing that right now. Donald Trump, I don't think the civil suits will do it. But if Donald Trump, which I think is very likely, is convicted of felonies, that's going to shake up everything. And I think make Donald Trump a totally toxic, unelectable candidate, regardless of the keys.
So, Professor, still, on the topic of the Trump legal woes, um, how do you foresee these developments affecting the public perception of the Republican Party and consequently the charismatic incumbent key, being that many folks have said, well, he's Teflon Trump. No matter what happens to him, he still draws voters. Trump himself said he could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and not lose any voters. Now, would any of these legal woes have any effect on how the Republican Party and how the leader of that Republican Party, Donald J. Trump, is perceived?
Yeah. I don't think the civil judgments will, which kind of amaze me. The chair of the Republican Party in Florida was accused of rape. No proof. The case was dropped, and Republicans all were outraged and forced him to resign. Trump was found by a jury, a civil jury, to be guilty, not of sexual harassment, as the media has mischaracterized it, but sexual assault, assaulting this woman. Not technically rape under New York law, but as the judge said, as commonly understood, he raped her, and they don't seem to care. But there are two very interesting polls, one out of Iowa and one out of New Hampshire, of Republican voters in the Republican primary. And in Iowa, they were the hardcore. No independents could vote. These were the strong Trump base, and 31% of those who braved minus 35 wind chills to vote in Iowa said if Trump was convicted of felonies, he would not be fit to serve as president. And in New Hampshire, almost half. Now, there were some independents sprinkled in there, but Trump needs Republican leading independents. Almost half said if Trump was convicted of felonies, he would not be fit to serve as president. So I think even though over 9 years, nothing seems to have moved Donald Trump supporters, a criminal conviction at least has that potential.
And forgive my picture. I think my camera may have been frozen, but Professor, if you could still hear me,
Yes.
Trump's wealth was cited as a factor in encouraging an unusually high punitive damages award. In the keys to the White House model, do financial considerations such as wealth of a candidate play a role in predicting electoral outcomes?
The wealth of the candidates plays no role whatsoever. I mean, Donald Trump should have beaten Joe Biden in 2020. He's vastly richer than Joe Biden was. John McCain was certainly richer than Barack Obama, who wasn't rich at all in 2008. So the wealth of the individual candidates plays no role whatsoever. You still there?
Yes, Professor. Sorry.
Okay.
Now, I want to pivot to the ongoing efforts by the Republican Party in the House of Representatives to impeach Secretary Mayorkas. I believe this is the first time something like this has happened, going back until I think 1871. Is that correct?
Yeah, you got to go back to the Grant administration and the impeachment of the Secretary of War.
Now, being that there is a scandal key, does this equate? I have to ask: does this rise to the level of some concern to turn that scandal key? Now, of course, this their basis of impeaching Secretary Mayorkas is because they're saying that he is responsible for the ongoing chaos at the southern border. Your response, sir?
Yeah, first of all, they haven't shown he committed high crimes and misdemeanors. It's a policy dispute. And we've seen Donald Trump now trying to torpedo an effort to secure the border, a bipartisan effort. Does that mean if he's elected president, he should be impeached because of what he did to ensure chaos at the border? Of course not. So there really is no basis in constitutional law for this impeachment. Secondly, to turn the key, it's got to directly affect the president, not a subordinate. Thirdly, there has to be at least some bipartisan recognition of scandal. And this is simply a political ploy being pushed by Republicans that has zero support from any Democrats.
I did mention the clash between Donald Trump and the Teamsters president. The Teamsters are navigating disagreements on border issues. How do you see the Teamsters stance influencing the potential congressional gains key? I think that's pertaining to the first key in the 2024 election cycle.
Which key are you talking about?
Midterm gains, but I know the midterm
That's
is
already been done. We
right.
already had the midterm election, and that one was one of the keys that went against Biden. So that key is already decided.
Of course, and Trump criticized the proposed immigration bill and emphasized the importance of a great bill. How might debates on immigration bills impact the perception of the economy, considering short-term economy being the fifth key and strong long-term economy being the sixth key?
Yeah, let me say, Trump criticizing the bill for not being good enough. Remember, for years, he was criticizing the Affordable Care Act for not being good enough. And for years, he was promising to come up with a better bill. And what has he come up with? Zero. And what does he come up with on a better bill that could get bipartisan support? Zero. This is purely a political ploy on Donald Trump's part because he doesn't want to solve the border problem. He wants to keep the border in chaos because he wants to use it as a political issue against Joe Biden. This is one of the most shameful of so many shameful things that Donald Trump has done, keeping alive a crisis, scuttling a bipartisan agreement purely for political gain. And that's been Donald Trump's MO throughout his career. All he cares about is himself and his wealth, his political position, doesn't care one whit about anybody else. And this, of course, has no effect directly on either the long term economy key, which is in very good shape. Growth has been very robust under Joe Biden, and the short term economic key. You never know, of course, whether the economy will hit recession or not, but so far it hasn't.
So, Professor, on that note, you have a lot of folks that say the Republican Party still is the party that they trust when it comes down to national security issues, when it comes down to securing the southern border. The Republican Party has done a masterful job in whipping up the American people into a frenzy that this has become an issue. You now have more left-leaning cable news sites like MSNBC and CNN actually conceding that the southern border is a top election issue. Has the Republican Party conceded its position as the party of national defense and national security because of the chaos that they're allowing to continue for political purposes and for intentionally blurring the faces of the January 6th rioters? You had the speaker, Mike Johnson, say that he was going to reveal the footage, but blur the faces of the rioters to protect their identities. And I always said, that's like me saying, I caught the perpetrators of my home invasion. I go to the police officer and I said, don't worry, officers, I blurred the guys' faces to protect their identity.
The Republicans had a big issue on the border, and they've now blown it, absolutely blown it by trying to torpedo, led by Donald Trump, the first comprehensive piece of legislation on border security in many, many decades. They now have lost all their moral authority on the border, and they've lost their moral authority on law and order. They claim to be the party of law and order, and as you indicate, they want to whitewash the insurrection on January 6, 2021, the only time Americans have violently stormed the U.S. Capitol. They injured over 140 police officers. There were some 5 deaths directly or indirectly associated with it. Absolute lawlessness, and now Republicans are trying to whitewash that. Forget about Republicans caring about border security or law and order. They've blown it.